welcome to the CMR audio project. The CMR is the Institute for Coastal and Marine Research at the Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. I'm David, or Dave if you prefer, and today's guest is Dr. Tommy Bornman. Tommy is a coastal manager at SCION, the South African Environmental Observation Network, and with the word environmental in that mix, I took every opportunity I could get to ask Tommy a challenging, environmentally focused or ecologically focused question, and he duly answered them all. Please note that all views and opinions expressed during the CMR audio project interviews are those of the participants alone and do not reflect any official position or policy of the Nelson Mandela University. If you have any questions or comments, please send them my way. cmraudioproject@gmail.com. Dr. Bornman, Tommy, thank you for being willing to have this interview. I've been trying to get you as a guest for a while now. You've been busy, very busy time of year. Now you're here, so I'm looking really forward to hearing some of your views. You know that the general plan with this is to get some of the who, what, and why. Who are you, what are you doing, and why are you doing it? I've highlighted ecological and environmental issues in other episodes, and with you being a node manager at SCION, the South African Environment Observation Network, you're a great person to ask questions to about ecology and environment. But before I do that, could we begin with a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, thank you, David. I come from a big family, and I'm what they call a laat-lammetjie. So when I was 5 years old, my parents retired, and they moved down to the coast. So I basically grew up in a small little town called Oyster Bay here in the Eastern Cape, just west of Cape St. Francis. And I went to school in Humansdorp. But obviously, growing up at the coast on the beach, I was very interested in the sea and the natural environment. So that was always an area that interested me. So when I went to university, initially I really wanted to study oceanography. But the day I arrived, they told me that oceanography closed at the then University of Port Elizabeth. And they recommended I go and study geology. So I said, no, I've got two brothers that are geologists. This is not really for me. I'm interested in the ocean. So I took the decision to go and study marine biology. And from there, I did my undergrad. Like I think most people studying marine biology, they all want to study the animals, the big and hairies, the dolphins and the things like that, because that's, what you tend to see on TV. But through my undergrad, I got really interested in marine plants. And so for honors, I did marine botany, continued with it during a master's. I worked on seaweed, macroalgae. One of my honors projects was on phytoplankton as well, and I was really interested in phytoplankton. And then I changed tack a bit for a PhD and did estuarine ecology, just because it's so topical and important on the coastline of all coasts of the world, and the importance specifically of freshwater to the natural environment. Yeah, and after I finished my studies, went to go and work for my brother in safari business for 8 months just to take a break. And when I came back, I started work at the university again, at the Institute for Coastal and Marine Research as a consultant. And I worked there for a couple of years. And then I got a call from Angus Patterson at the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity, and he asked me if I would be interested to work or apply for a job as the coordinator of the African Coelacanth ecosystem program, which I then did, and I got the job. Moved to Grahamstown, and I worked for ASEP for 3 years. At the same time, I was also seconded to the UN-funded Agulhas and Somali Current Large Marine Ecosystem Program, which I really enjoyed because it involved me organizing all the research cruises, going on the research cruises throughout the Western Indian Ocean. All the nice places, Seychelles, Mauritius, Comores, and those places. And then I applied for the job to become the manager of the South African Environmental Observation Network's coastal node, which was then based in Grahamstown. But for logistical reasons, we moved it down to Port Elizabeth a couple of years ago. I've been there ever since.
That is so diverse. Are you out and about most of the time doing field work, or do you find yourself quite office-bound with the SION obligations?
SION, basically we mandated to set up observatories throughout South Africa. We've got several terrestrial nodes, but also the marine nodes. And we put in situ sensors, basically, whether it's a weather station on a mountain or a current or wave sensor deep down on the seafloor. Our mandate is to do this to collect long-term reliable scientific data, specifically for climate and global change research. So our work invariably involves a lot of field work. We need to go and maintain these instruments indefinitely into the future. So yes, we spend a lot of time out on the ocean and under the ocean and on the beaches, which is a fantastic job. But of course, it also comes with a lot of administration and bureaucracy. So as the manager, unfortunately, I don't spend as much time out in the field now as I had a couple of years ago. But luckily, through SION, we can still do our own research. And I get the opportunity to go on research expeditions all over the world.
Your profile picture is one of you in a wetsuit with a snorkel on, and you're in the water. So
yes.
I have this sort of romanticized picture of you as this ocean man of action, always out there, always following some kind of animal, doing the field work. So it looks a little romanticized. Yes. You're making it sound like it's a mixture of field work plus then the desk work. What kind of student opportunity is there to get involved with what happens at SION, or is it something that one has to apply to as a job? How would a student get involved at SION?
Obviously, we collect lots of in situ data. So the idea is that all the data that we collect is freely available, as well as the research platforms to the science community in South Africa. Because we spend a lot of time out in the field, we've got a lot of knowledge, more so than most, on how these ecosystems function. So one of our objectives and key performance indicators is capacity building and training. So each of the scientists at SION do have a couple of students that we either supervise or co-supervise with other researchers at the universities. So we normally link in with university researchers. So the students can gain access to these platforms through the university structures. Or they can approach us directly if they are interested in something specific. We don't have our own specific pool of bursaries. We apply for bursaries in the same way as any other researcher at the university would do. We tend to attract a certain kind of student that enjoys fieldwork. They're actually becoming, few and far between now. You would think everyone would like to go diving and exploring icebergs and things like that, but we actually struggle to get students that are interested in fieldwork nowadays.
Why do you think that's the case?
Why is Sardinia Bay Beach empty on a beautiful day? People are sitting at home watching TV or playing on their cell phones or going to the mall. I think society, has changed over the last couple of years in that it's easier to do a lab study or research, that you've got control over, than to do field work. And field work is hard. You have to go in the field early in the morning. You sometimes stay out at sea for days or months at end, whether it rains or the sun shines. And not everyone is keen for that kind of activity anymore.
When I tried to get you on a couple of weeks ago, I think you were out in the field. Could you illustrate what that looks like for us? What practical tasks were you fulfilling out, I think it was Cape St. Francis way?
Yes, that was with Dr. Gavin Grishworth from the university. He had a project on stromatolites. So basically, he put together a multidisciplinary team of researchers looking at specific components of the ecosystem that we were studying. And each one of us had our own tasks. And the good thing is we all go out at the same time. So we know that the data we're collecting on the plants, on the animals, on the chemical environment, on the physical environment is collected at the same time. So we can pool all our data together to get a better understanding of the ecosystem at the same time. Coastal work like that is very easy because you drive there, you climb out the car, you walk around on the rocky shore, you do your analysis, collect your water samples, filter it, prepare the samples, store them and take them back to the lab for analysis. But a typical day for us would involve going out to sea, which means waking up quite early because you want to get the most out of the day and you don't know how the weather is going to change during the day. So we normally go out very early in the morning on the boats and start sampling and try and be back in the office by, say, 3 or 4 o'clock. So there's time, to clean all the equipment, to preserve the samples and get everything ready for the laboratory analysis, which probably takes more time than the fieldwork itself. The actual collection of the samples is the easy part. It's the analysis afterwards where, all the hard work goes in. And after that, you need to analyze the data. And so this romantic idea of always just being out at sea, we probably only spend about a third of our time at sea. The rest is in the laboratory or in front of the computer.
You mentioned that it was a multidisciplinary team that was out there in Cape St. Francis. Could you talk a little bit about the components of that multidisciplinary team? Dr. Bernadette Snow spoke about multidisciplinarity in the first episode, and I thought it would be a nice illustration just to see what that looks like in practice.
Transdisciplinary, I think, is an even bigger buzzword now than multidisciplinary. So we normally focus on multidisciplinary. We don't have expertise in the social sciences as such at Scion. So we look at multidisciplinary. So we have physical scientists, we have biological scientists, we have chemical scientists, all working together because we realized quite quickly that you can't understand the ecosystem by just looking at one component of it. You need to look at all the components and all the variables to better understand how the ecosystem functions and how it possibly could respond to changes. So, for example, on that field trip we did with Gavin, we had biologists looking at the different species. So you'll have a zoo person that looks at the animals. You'll have someone looking at the macroalgae. You'll have someone looking at the microalgae. You'll have someone looking at the chemistry of the water. Someone looking at the geology. We'll have a GIS person mapping what the ecosystem looks like spatially. And then we also have sensors that we deploy in the ecosystem that continuously record data on, say, for example, temperature, salinity, and things like that. And it's only when we all put our data together that the picture starts to become a little bit clearer. We won't have all the answers, obviously. I think, ecosystems are extremely complex. And I think that's the problem we sit with in trying to understand the response to climate and global changes. The world is such a complex ecosystem, and we know so little of it. And through our models, we try and to come up with the best representation of that ecosystem with a few variables that we have data for. But invariably, we might know we have data for 10 variables, but the ecosystem consists of 1,000 variables. So that's why our models are not always spot on. And that's sometimes, the struggle that climate change scientists sit with, is that the climate change deniers will then say, well, clearly this is not happening because you were wrong. The icebergs didn't melt when we reached 2 degrees above average. And it's just because, it's such a complex system and we don't know all the feedback loops and so forth. So the bigger the multidisciplinary team, the better we can understand the ecosystem. And then, of course, very important is transdisciplinarity, to bring in the social component, because we are such a part of the ecosystem now. There is no more natural environment, really, where we have not influenced. So it's important that we include people in what we do, because, we are increasingly becoming an important driver of the ecosystem.
Does that fact sometimes concern you or worry you looking into the future? We're getting another 1 billion people or so over the next 30 years, I think. Our resource use is already pretty high. We're adding solar and wind, renewable energy to fossil fuel energy. It doesn't seem to be replacing fossil fuels. It seems to be added to it. This looks like a kind of precarious situation. Do you have any thoughts on it?
It's very disconcerting. It hit home really hard when I was on the Antarctic circumnavigation expedition around Antarctica. In my samples, I kept on finding microfibers, microplastics. And this is in the Southern Ocean, basically in the Antarctic. Really a lot of microplastics. And on a recent expedition to the Weddell Sea as well, we looked at air samples, sediment samples. I mean, in the most pristine environments you can think of, areas that has not seen sunshine, that it's been under the ice for 100,000 years, you find microplastics now. So it's tough for the scientists to see this because it's really worrisome. And what is even more worrying is how quickly this has happened. So quickly, we went from there being a problem to there being a serious problem. Which brings us to the point of tipping points. Where are these tipping points, and have we actually reached them, and is it possible to actually reverse some of the damages that we have done? It's quite interesting. We had, as part of science, we have an annual science meeting, and one of the workshops on ecological grief. And it's becoming a problem for scientists, is ecological grief, because we're at the coalface of the changes taking place. So a lot of the scientists are actually experiencing what they call now ecological grief, because you see this happening and there's nothing you can do about it, really.
I started experiencing that 10 years ago.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, for me it was a big motivation to live more frugally, live more rustically. I don't think we're going to rise to the challenge of undoing our damage, but it certainly helps on the ethical side of the spectrum, I think, to know that, you're less of an impact on your immediate environment. Of course, we all are taking massive amounts of resources. If we, for example, own a vehicle, how do you rationalize that? Yet it's become such a norm in our culture. So it's quite difficult to make sense of emotionally. I watched 3 documentaries this year that the last one really left me in tears, and it was quite strange. I watched first Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs's Planet of the Humans, which is very problematic. Yes. It's misrepresented a few things. Thereafter, I watched Life on Our Planet, David Attenborough's Life on Our Planet, and he's more acclaimed, but it makes very much the same point. It even uses the same orangutan footage. Well, not exactly the same, but it could be the same stock footage that those guys used. The forest is gone. The orangutan has nowhere to go except Moore and Gibbs crossed that forbidden line and showed the dying orangutan. Very hard to stomach. And then finally I watched My Octopus Teacher, which is supposed to be this feel-good, uplifting thing. It anthropomorphizes the octopus. There's this emotional bond there. Yet that in the background, that environment, that pristine, beautiful environment is in threat. And the last scene, I think, in that documentary is the guy, what's his name again? Doesn't matter. He's swimming out with a bunch of other people. And I'm thinking, okay, but they're getting into that pristine environment. We're just unstoppable. So maybe I could use that as a segue into a hypothetical question for you. Let's assume there is this potentially tumultuous time ahead for us as a species. Of course, it's the other species as well that we're taking out, many, many a day. So could I ask you to imagine that you're 18 years old, but you now know at 18 what you know as an older adult scientist, especially this kind of ecological stuff. What would you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think I would become an activist like the Greta Thunbergs. I think they play a very important role in getting the message across to people. Activists are good in that they can sway public opinion by showing drastic footage, like you just said about the orangutans. But I think scientists have got a more important role to play in that they can present these arguments rationally in words. So as an 18-year-old now, knowing what I know, I probably wouldn't change too much in the field that I would have followed, because I strongly believe that is where I can make the biggest difference, is by presenting the data to the policymakers and the politicians that says we are changing the environment and that we need to do something about it, and actually come up with, not just tell them that there's a problem, but come up with some mitigation measures.
Do you think here in South Africa that message is getting through?
Yeah, it's one of our biggest struggles. The scientists are not really equipped to get the message across. Some of the policymakers are not, doesn't have an appetite for the message that is coming their way. So there's definitely scope for an intermediate group of people to, take that message and make sense of it for the policymakers so that they can use it. There's a bit of a disjunct between the science taking place and the policies to a certain extent. Not always, but quite often. It's not a South African problem, it's a global problem.
What I'm hearing from you is jogging my memory from a podcast with a NASA JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab guy named Peter Kalmus.
Yes.
So he was very, very vocal about the need for big changes in business as usual. And I think you're contextualizing something I was going to ask you. He said that climate scientists have more or less done their work, and it's the work of the social scientists that is now crucial. And in the context of climate and ecological crises, I think you're saying that the social sciences might play a bigger role in getting the message out there. Maybe, the psychologists can tell us what kind of message has a more important impact on people, what can put people off. I think that's the Michael Moore documentary, seeing the orangutan die is very off-putting, and it encourages more of that sense of eco-grief. But do you think there's anything else that the physical scientists like you guys can do? Or do you just keep doing what you're doing and then the social scientists are going to somehow step in and help?
I think it's definitely time for the social scientists to step up to the plate. The physical and the biogeochemical scientists must continue doing what they're doing, because even if we increase the number of scientists 1,000-fold, we would still not be able to fully understand how the ecosystem functions and how it will change. I mean, every time things change, there's ripple effects right through the ecosystem. So we need to continue monitoring and observing the environment and how it changes so that we can better inform the social scientists and the policymakers and so forth. So there's definitely a need for us to continue observing the environment. But the social scientists, I think, are probably the most important people at this moment, because what we need to do now is to make people appreciate the intrinsic value of nature. And the physical scientist cannot do it. I don't know if you've ever read that paper by Garrett Hardin. It was published long ago, 1968.
No.
In Science. And it's called The Tragedy of the Commons. So I can send you the paper. I mean, it's as relevant, if not more relevant now than it was in 1968. And basically what he says is you cannot appeal to people's conscience like they do through these documentaries. You're actually creating, as you say, ecological grief, and that's not helping anyone. Recognition of necessity is important. So people need to recognize the necessity of changing the way we live. And he calls it, we need to mutual coercion that is mutually agreed upon. And that's the only way forward, because rationale for action on climate change is not economic or scientific or social or political or anything like that. We face a serious moral problem in terms of climate change. And that's the mindset change that needs to happen amongst all the people. Otherwise, we're not going to survive this. We are really facing an uncertain future as on this planet. No, I wouldn't say as a species, as all species. And the only way to survive it is if we change the way we do things completely and utterly.
Am I hearing from you a slight change from, let's say, a decade ago? A decade ago, you were quoted as saying this: as a scientist, I would rather err on the side of caution and say that any impacts are not immediately evident. And then the writer says, he argues, adding that it is very difficult to separate natural cycles from human-induced impacts. The challenge is to try and distinguish what impact we as human beings are having on the planet. But what I'm hearing from you now, Dr. Bornman, is that it seems like you're more on the side of the fence that says, hey, look at what we're doing. Our impacts are considerable. You've just said it. We need to radically change the way we live. Am I picking that up correctly?
Yes. In terms of publishing my papers on how things are changing, I still stay with the statement from 10 years ago. I need to make sure that my data is accurately represented, which is still at this stage. We don't necessarily pick up the cycles because our data sets, say for Algoa Bay, is only 12 years, 15 years old. But we cannot afford to wait 50 years. We can't afford to wait 60 years before that patterns emerge. And then what are we going to say? Oh, we were right all along. We should have, implemented some mitigation measures 50 years ago. The evidence is there. It's quite clear for everyone to see that our environment is drastically changing as a result of our own activities. And the science will continue in the background and will support a lot of what we decide is important for us to do. But I think the days of waiting for a 95% confidence is over. We don't have that luxury to wait anymore.
Yeah, agreed. And I took action into my own hands. Well, my partner and I did by just downscaling everything massively and learning to love a low-tech, rustic lifestyle. We did that probably because we were in a more or less privileged position to be able to do so. But once you get there, things become pretty, she hates it when I say this, cheap and cheerful. So you don't need as much money. You don't need to be as plugged into the system necessarily. Things change. So I found it really interesting that some of the things that we can do that are less ecologically impactful are also inherently good for human beings too. You're barefoot in the wood chip and in the soil. You're carrying buckets of animal manure around to make compost. So you've got that microflora activity that's encouraged through the bugs in your environment. It's a great environment to be in.
No, listen, I agree. But how do we convince everyone to follow that kind of lifestyle? That's the problem. I mean, it just brings you back to the tragedy of the commons. I mean, I speak to my neighbors and they can't believe that I carry water from my water tanks to fill the toilet cisterns because they said, but water's so cheap. I mean, whether you use 2,000 liters of municipal water or 20,000 liters of municipal water in a month, it only costs you 100 Rand more. Yeah. So why go through the effort of carrying water up to your toilets? And they don't understand that water is just shared resource and it is very scarce in South Africa and soon it's going to run out.
I've got an answer to that. It's not a specific answer. It's more of a general one. The philosopher Bergson, he once spoke about something called habitual perception. And I would say that the kind of way of looking at the world where water is cheap, I would describe that as being compatible with habitual perception. You've been brought up as a kid who evaluates things in terms of costs and benefits and expenses and money. But the philosopher Pierre Hadot writes about how important it is to displace habitual perception. Now, so my feeling is that anything that displaces habitual perception can jerk you awake and out of that comfortable zone of quote unquote normal perception. How you do that, I'm not going to prescribe that, but I think there's a number of things you can do. For me, seeing that dying orangutan, I think if I hadn't already made some changes in my life, I would have been provoked to think more carefully about that, certainly. So I think that was powerful. I think it crossed a forbidden line. We're not used to seeing that. We're not used to having our habitual perception provoked and jerked out of its normal operational stage. But I want to use that as a segue into, because you've mentioned again the tragedy of the commons, this mutual coercion in mutually agreeable ways. Is that the phrase?
Yeah, mutual coercion that is mutually agreed upon. So we all agree that we're going to coerce ourselves into doing something differently. To make a law that says you must stop at a stop street only works if there is a policeman standing at the stop street.
Right.
And then the policeman is just a human. So not long, and then that policeman is either not standing there, or you can tip him R5 and drive over the stop street in any case.
Right. So you're talking about some kind of baton, some kind of stick. I think carrot and stick, and you're describing a stick in some ways. So do you have any ideas on this?
Yes, but mutually agreed on that we all know that we're heading to the precipice. And if we're going to force each other to change the way we do things, because if we don't, we're going to go over the cliff.
Okay. So I had a second hypothetical question for you, which is, imagine a change that would dramatically jerk humanity towards responding in those kinds of mutually agreed ways. What would facilitate this change in your imaginary world?
It's probably not imaginary. I think it is an actual extreme event, climatic event.
Okay.
That really touches people. So like the droughts in Cape Town, where they were close to approaching day zero. It brought the reality. We tried to convince people for years about climate change, and we did all sorts of educational outreach programs and whatever. Nothing was as effective as the fact that the taps were running dry.
Yeah.
And people realized that this is climate change in action. It is happening right here, right now. It is not icebergs melting. It is happening right here in our city. And that changed the way a lot of people went about their business. The only way for people to realize what is happening is for an extreme event, to force them out of their comfort zone and make them realize that, listen, we need to change the way we do our things.
There's a book called A Paradise Born in Hell, and the main focus is on how people come together when there's a disaster. And I think what you're saying is that people will change when their hands are forced to change, which is kind of unfortunate but true. And I think I agree and resonate with your comment about activism. It is important, but I'm not sure that rattling the cage that much, which then gets you sometimes prodded, if you're provoking people too much, is really the way to go. It's important, but I'm not sure if it's the main thing. I think it's part of a different set of ingredients. But ultimately, the main ingredient is when the water stops coming out the tap. It's unfortunate.
People only realize when it actually affects them physically.
I'd like to change focus just briefly as we near the end of our interview. You've been in the field and researching for a long time. I'm wondering if there's anything that stands out for you as particularly memorable and what you took from the event.
Oh, there's so many things, that's why I love sciences. Even though we do long-term stuff and it's very repetitive, going out every month to the same place. Each time you look at the data or analyze the sample, there's something surprising, there's something new that keeps you on your toes. But in terms of my science, that's really memorable. I would say the first time I saw a coelacanth, we just bought this remotely operated vehicle, one of South Africa's first ones, and we dived on the coelacanths in Sodwana Bay, and to actually see that animal down there was really amazing for me.
For anyone who doesn't know about coelacanths, why is it such a special sighting?
Yeah, well, coelacanths were only known from the fossil record and were thought to have died out basically with the dinosaurs. So even here in Grahamstown, in the old estuarine environments, paleo-estuarine environments, you find them in the fossil record. So they used to be an estuarine fish. And then in the 1936, I think, they trawled up a live coelacanth off the coast of South Africa. So that was very big news then, because they realized that this animal they thought to be extinct was actually still alive. And then, over the years in the 50s and the 70s, more and more fish were being caught in the Comores, Mozambique, South Africa, as the fish stocks became depleted and the fishermen started fishing deeper and deeper. They started catching these fish. So in South Africa, there's a healthy population of them living off the Natal coast, possibly closer down to Port Elizabeth as well, because the first one was caught off East London. But we haven't explored that part of the ocean properly yet, so we don't know how big the actual population of the species is. It's an ancient fish, still alive today, living in a completely different environment than it did millions of years ago. it's a key flagship species, basically, of South Africa, and of great tourism potential and economic interest and biological interest, of course, for South Africa.
Hugely symbolic as well, because when you're looking at that animal, you're looking back at an ancient life form, a world that was so different to the one that we know, yet it's still there. In some ways, it's kind of hopeful. Does anything else stand out for you?
Recently I've gone quite a few times to Antarctica, and that's a place that's very special to me, just because of the sheer beauty of it, the fact that it's been there and only been, basically discovered 200 years ago for the first time as anyone set foot on it. There's so little that we actually know about the place. So just for me, that's really amazing to study that ecosystem, especially if you go back in time looking at the sedimentary records and the ice core records and so forth, to try and understand the global ecosystem and how things changed over the thousands and millions of years by studying ice cores and sediment cores in Antarctica. Yeah, that's quite a highlight for me as well.
So those are some of the specific highlights and points that you've gleaned over your career as a biologist. But could I ask you if there's anything that stands out as maybe like a general lesson that you've learned along the way? I'm sure you've learned many, many things, but is there one kind of takeaway lesson that stands out for you?
The complexity of life on Earth and how we're not even scratching the surface of understanding how everything functions and how everything fits together. That if you pull a little string on this side, it affects the global ecosystem. The fact that the Agulhas current that runs past our shore and changes in that current affects the climate in the northern hemisphere. That to me is the most amazing thing that I've discovered through my science career, is how complex the environment is and how really very little we know about it. We think we're this top species on the surface that knows everything, but we know so little of our own environment that we live in. And there is so much to do. And the urgency to do and study and research more is getting more and more important, because as the environment changes, so does the ecosystem. And if we don't have an understanding of the baseline, we can't say that things have changed. So there's also this real urgency for us to better understand as much as possible, as quickly as possible.
Am I hearing between the lines an appeal to more humility?
Oh, yes. No, definitely. I think, there's nothing like an earthquake or a volcano exploding to make us realize that we are just another inhabitant on this planet. We're not above nature. Definitely not. Although we may feel like that. As you said, maybe people need to walk barefoot in the soil, to realize that we are part of this earth and we're not above it.
And I'll work towards a conclusion just by emphasizing what's in a name, SION, South African Environmental Observation Network. For me, observation is massively important. For example, take your shoes off, walk barefoot on the ground and observe where you are, what you're walking on, and you'll realize, well, assuming it's not concrete, if it's a patch of soil, look carefully at the soil and the life that is in that soil. Where you put your foot matters. Everything you do in that natural environment has an impact there. So I think the observation aspect of what you do is crucial. And I'd just like to thank you and encourage other people just to think carefully about what observation actually means to them and in a context where we're dealing with so many challenges. Dr. Bornman, I've taken a fair amount of your time. I've really enjoyed the perspective that you're giving here. The last question I'm going to ask you is just for recommendations on books or films, documentaries, podcasts, or anything that might be of interest to listeners.
I think you've mentioned a few. I'm not too fond of environmental documentaries, probably because of the ecological grief that is normally, that they try and pull out of you. I've always been interested in exploration And as I said, there's so much for us to still explore. So what I prefer reading is the old explorers, the Voyage of the Discovery, the Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin, and those things, and try and apply it to your own life, how things have changed since then. How similar are things still? Why are things changing? And what can you do to mitigate some of these changes? Because, I don't always trust these documentaries. They're not always very accurate. But to get the message out to the broader community, that's probably the way to go.
Well, that brings us to the end of the interview. Thank you very much again for your time. And yeah, I look forward to chatting to you again. Hopefully we've got some good news to talk about when it comes to more people getting on board to figure out how to have less of an impact on our sensitive and beautiful ecologies around us.
Agreed.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Bornman. Keep well. Ciao.
Cheers.
That's the end of the episode. Thanks for listening. Any questions or comments can go to cmraudioproject@gmail.com. All episodes of the CMR Audio Project can be downloaded at archive.org. Head over to archive.org and search for CMR Audio Project. You should be on your way. Many thanks to Kendall Beeden, who made the theme music for this audio project. His email address is kendallbeeden@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, as always, may the tides of life treat you kindly.